There is a quiet moment that most people overlook. It happens in conversations, in meetings, in passing exchanges that seem ordinary on the surface. Nothing dramatic, no raised voices, no obvious persuasion, just words moving back and forth. But beneath that surface, something far more important is taking place. Decisions are being shaped. Perceptions are being adjusted. Trust is either being built or quietly weakened. And most people never realize when that moment begins. They think influence is loud. They think it belongs to the most confident voice in the room, the person who speaks the longest, the one who appears certain. But influence rarely announces itself. It works in silence first. It begins long before someone agrees with you, and often long before you even speak. You've felt it before. A conversation where someone didn't pressure you, yet you found yourself naturally aligned with their thinking. A moment where you changed your mind, not because you were forced, but because something about their presence made their perspective feel clear, not dominant, not overwhelming, just reasonable. That is influence at its highest level, not control, not manipulation, but clarity that others can trust. And here's the part that most people misunderstand. Influence is not something you switch on in the moment. It is something you build long before the moment arrives, because people don't respond only to your words. They respond to how those words feel coming from you. They respond to your emotional steadiness, your timing, your ability to understand what matters to them, without making them feel analyzed or exposed. In many cases, people don't resist ideas. They resist how those ideas are delivered. And this is where the art begins. Because influencing people is not about pushing harder, it is about removing resistance without force. It is about creating an environment where agreement feels natural, not pressured, where the other person doesn't feel convinced. They feel understood. And when someone feels understood, something changes. Their guard lowers. Their thinking becomes more flexible. Their attention sharpens. Not because they are being persuaded, but because they are being respected. This is not a trick. It is a discipline. And like any discipline, it requires awareness first. Most people enter conversations with one goal: to be heard. But those who influence effectively enter with a different priority: to understand before they attempt to be understood. This doesn't mean silence. It means precision. It means listening not just to respond, but to detect patterns. What does this person value? What are they protecting? What are they uncertain about, but unwilling to say directly? These signals are subtle. They don't appear in clear statements. They appear in tone shifts, in hesitation, in the words people repeat, in the things they avoid. And if you miss these signals, your message may still be correct, but it will not land. Because influence is not about delivering truth alone. It is about delivering truth in a way that the other person is ready to receive. And readiness is not logical. It is emotional first. This is where many intelligent people struggle. They rely on facts, on reasoning, on being right. But being right does not automatically create influence. In many cases, it creates resistance. Because when someone feels corrected, they often feel challenged. And when they feel challenged, they protect their position, even if, internally, they are unsure. So, the question becomes, how do you guide someone without triggering that resistance? How do you present ideas in a way that invites consideration instead of defensiveness? The answer is not in speaking more. It is in speaking with awareness. Awareness of timing. Awareness of emotional state. Awareness of how your words will likely be interpreted, not just how they are intended. because intention does not guarantee impact. And influence lives in impact, not in effort. There is also something deeper, something less obvious but far more powerful. People are constantly evaluating safety. Not physical safety, but psychological safety. They ask, often without realizing it, is this person trying to dominate me or understand me? Is this conversation a competition or a collaboration? Will I be respected here or corrected? These questions shape how people listen to you. Before they process your words, they process you, your tone, your pace, your presence. If they sense pressure, they close slightly. If they sense judgment, they withdraw slightly. If they sense genuine clarity and steadiness, they open. Not completely, but enough. And influence begins in that small opening. This is why influence cannot be separated from self-control. If your emotions fluctuate sharply, your message becomes unstable. If your tone carries frustration, your words lose precision. If your intent feels rushed, your message feels forced, and force reduces trust. But when your delivery is calm, consistent, and measured, your words carry weight without needing volume. This does not mean becoming passive. It means becoming deliberate. There is a difference. Passive communication avoids tension. Deliberate communication manages it. Because influence does not eliminate tension. It navigates it carefully. There will be disagreement. There will be hesitation. There will be moments where the other person is not aligned. And in those moments, your response determines everything. Do you push harder? Do you withdraw? Or do you adjust? Those who influence effectively do something subtle. They slow down, not externally, always, but internally. They create space between reaction and response. And in that space, they make better decisions. They choose words that maintain connection even during disagreement. They avoid turning conversations into battles, because once a conversation becomes a battle, influence decreases, even if you win the argument. This is a critical distinction. Winning is not influencing. Agreement under pressure is not alignment. Real influence is when someone adopts an idea willingly and carries it forward without you. That is the standard. And reaching that standard requires something most people overlook: patience. Not passive waiting, but strategic patience. Understanding that influence often unfolds over time. A single conversation rarely completes the process, but it can begin it. It can plant clarity. It can reduce resistance. It can shift perspective slightly. And small shifts, repeated over time, become lasting change. So the objective is not to dominate the moment. It is to guide it, to move it forward, even slightly, in a direction that benefits both sides. Because influence that benefits only one side rarely lasts. People recognize imbalance, even if they cannot articulate it. And when they do, trust weakens. But when influence is grounded in mutual benefit, something stronger develops. Respect. And respect amplifies influence. It makes future conversations easier. It reduces friction. It increases openness. And over time, it builds a reputation. Not of someone who persuades aggressively, but someone whose perspective is worth considering. This is the real power. Not immediate compliance, but long-term credibility. And credibility compounds. Each interaction either strengthens it or weakens it. There is no neutral, which means every conversation matters more than it appears, not because every conversation must succeed, but because every conversation leaves an impression, and impressions shape future outcomes. So, as you begin to understand the art of influencing people, the focus must shift away from tactics alone, toward awareness, toward discipline, toward the ability to remain steady while others fluctuate. Because in many situations, the person who remains calm gains quiet influence, not because they dominate, but because they become a point of stability. And people are drawn to stability, especially in uncertain moments. This is where influence becomes almost invisible. It no longer feels like persuasion. It feels like guidance, not forced, not imposed, but chosen. And that is the highest form, the kind that lasts beyond the conversation, the kind that shapes decisions even when you are no longer present. But to reach that level, you must first understand something essential. Influence does not begin with others. It begins with you, your awareness, your control, your ability to listen without rushing, to speak without pushing, to guide without forcing, and to remain grounded, even when the conversation becomes difficult, because those are the moments that define your true influence. Not when everything is easy, but when alignment is uncertain, when resistance appears, when clarity is needed most. That is where the art reveals itself, and that is where we begin. The foundation of influence: internal control. Before, external impact. Before influence becomes visible in your words, it is already present in your state. Most people focus on what to say. Very few focus on who they are while they are saying it. And yet, this is where influence truly begins, because people are not only interpreting your language, they are interpreting your stability, your level of control, your consistency under subtle pressure. In many cases, they are not consciously aware of this evaluation, but it is happening, quietly, constantly. Every pause, every shift in tone, every moment of hesitation or tension sends signals, and those signals shape how your message is received. Not the content alone, but the delivery of that content through your internal state. This is why two people can say the same sentence and create completely different outcomes. One creates openness, the other creates resistance. Not because the words were different, but because the presence behind the words was different. And presence is not something you perform. It is something you regulate. This is the first layer of mastering influence: internal control before external communication. Because if your internal state is unstable, your influence becomes inconsistent. You may have strong arguments, but they will not land with precision. You may have valuable insights, but they will not carry weight, because people do not fully trust information that feels emotionally unstable, even if the information itself is accurate. So the question becomes, what does internal control actually look like? It is not about suppressing emotion. It is about managing expression. It is the ability to feel something without immediately reacting to it, to notice tension without letting it dictate your tone, to remain measured even when the conversation becomes uncertain. This does not make you passive. It makes you deliberate. And deliberateness is one of the most overlooked drivers of influence. Because when you respond with intention instead of reaction, your communication becomes clearer, cleaner, more controlled. And control, when expressed calmly, tends to build trust. Not dominance, not pressure, but trust. And trust is the gateway to influence. Without it, even the best ideas struggle to move forward. With it, even complex ideas become easier to accept. But trust is not built through statements. It is built through consistency, through repeated signals that show you are steady, that you are not easily thrown off balance, that your behavior does not shift unpredictably under stress. Because unpredictability creates hesitation, and hesitation reduces openness. So, internal control becomes your baseline, your starting point. Not something you activate only when needed, but something you maintain as a standard. This leads to a subtle but important shift. You stop trying to control the conversation, and you start controlling your contribution to it. This distinction matters, because trying to control the conversation often leads to force. Trying to control your contribution leads to clarity, and clarity tends to invite engagement. Now, there is another layer to this, one that requires a deeper level of awareness. Your internal state is not only shaped in the moment, it is shaped before the conversation even begins, by your expectations, your assumptions, your preparation. If you enter a conversation expecting resistance, your tone often becomes defensive. If you expect agreement, your tone may become careless. If you feel pressure to succeed, your delivery may become rushed. And all of these states subtly influence how others respond to you. So, influence does not start when you speak. It starts when you prepare your mindset, when you decide, consciously or not, how you will approach the interaction. This is where disciplined thinkers separate themselves. They do not enter conversations randomly. They enter with awareness, not rigid scripts, but clear intentions. What is the purpose of this conversation? What outcome would be beneficial for both sides? What emotional tone would support that outcome? These questions are not always answered explicitly, but they shape your behavior. They align your internal state with your objective. And when alignment is present, your communication becomes more effective, because you are not reacting moment to moment. You are operating from a stable framework. This does not eliminate uncertainty, but it reduces unnecessary friction. Now, consider what happens when internal control is absent. The conversation becomes reactive. Each statement triggers a response. Each disagreement creates tension. Each unexpected comment shifts your emotional state. And as your state shifts, your clarity decreases. Your words become less precise. Your tone becomes less consistent, and the other person senses this. Again, often without conscious awareness. But the effect is real. They become less certain, less open, more cautious. Because instability, even subtle, creates doubt. And doubt slows down influence. So, mastering influence requires mastering this internal layer first, before tactics, before strategies, before advanced communication techniques. Because without internal control, those techniques become unreliable. They may work sometimes, but not consistently. And consistency is what builds long-term influence. Now, this raises an important point. Internal control is not about becoming emotionless. It is about becoming intentional with emotion. There is a difference. Emotion, when expressed with control, can enhance communication. It can add emphasis. It can signal importance. It can create connection. But when emotion is uncontrolled, it creates distortion. It shifts the focus away from the message, toward the reaction. And once that happens, influence weakens. So the objective is not to remove emotion. It is to channel it, to decide when it supports your message and when it interferes. This requires practice, not theoretical understanding, but real-time awareness. Noticing when your tone begins to tighten, when your pace begins to accelerate, when your thoughts become reactive instead of deliberate. and then making small adjustments, slowing down slightly, recentering your focus, choosing your next words with intention. These adjustments are often subtle, but their impact is significant because they maintain the stability of your presence. And stability creates confidence, not only in you, but in the interaction itself. Now, let's go deeper. There is a concept that becomes essential at this stage: emotional neutrality under pressure. This does not mean you feel nothing. It means you do not let pressure dictate your behavior. You remain grounded even when the conversation becomes challenging. This is where influence often shifts, because when one person becomes reactive and the other remains steady, the dynamic changes. Not dramatically, but enough. The steady person begins to anchor the interaction. They become the reference point, the one who is not escalating, not withdrawing, but maintaining balance. And in many cases, this increases their influence, not because they overpower the other person, but because they stabilize the environment, and stability allows clearer thinking on both sides. This is important because influence is not about overwhelming someone's thinking. It is about improving the quality of the conversation, so that better decisions can emerge. And better decisions tend to happen in stable environments, not chaotic ones, not tense ones, but environments where both sides feel they can think clearly. So your internal control does more than regulate you. It shapes the space between you and the other person. It sets the tone, and tone often determines outcome. Now, there is one more layer, perhaps the most important one: self-awareness. Because you cannot regulate what you do not notice. You cannot adjust what you are not aware of. So, developing influence requires observing yourself. Not critically, but accurately. How do you respond under disagreement? Do you become sharper, quieter, more defensive, more forceful? Do you rush to prove your point, or do you slow down to understand theirs? These patterns matter because they repeat. And repeated patterns shape your influence over time. So the first step is not to change everything at once. It is to notice, to recognize your tendencies, and then gradually to refine them, to replace reaction with response, to replace urgency with precision, to replace tension with controlled clarity. This is not instant. It is developed through repetition, through awareness, through deliberate practice in real conversations. And as this internal discipline strengthens, something shifts. Your words begin to carry more weight, not because they are louder, but because they are supported by stability, by consistency, by presence. And people respond to that. They may not describe it in those terms, but they feel it. They feel when someone is grounded, when someone is not trying to force an outcome, when someone is communicating with clarity instead of pressure. And when they feel that, their openness increases, their resistance decreases, and influence becomes possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. And that is the foundation. Everything else builds on this. Every advanced communication technique, every strategic approach, every method of guiding conversations, all of it depends on this core. Your ability to remain steady, aware, and intentional, regardless of the situation. Because when you master that, you are no longer just speaking. You are shaping the interaction itself, quietly, consistently, effectively. And that is where real influence begins. Understanding human motivation. Without assumption. Once internal control becomes stable, a second layer of influence begins to open. Not through speaking more, but through seeing more. because influence is not only about how clearly you express your ideas, it is about how accurately you understand the other person's perspective. Inaccuracy in understanding is where many attempts at influence quietly fail. Not because people lack intelligence, but because they rely on assumptions. They assume they know what the other person wants. They assume they understand what matters to them. They assume they can predict how their message will be received. And in some cases, those assumptions feel correct. But influence is not built on what feels correct. It is built on what is actually present in the other person's thinking. And that difference, while subtle, changes everything. Because when you misread motivation, even slightly, your message becomes misaligned. It may sound logical to you, but it does not resonate with them. And when resonance is missing, influence weakens. So the discipline here is not to assume, it is to observe carefully, consistently, without rushing to conclusions. Because human motivation is layered. People rarely express their full reasoning directly. Not because they are hiding it intentionally, but because much of it operates below conscious awareness. They communicate through fragments, through partial explanations, through emotionally influenced language, and it becomes your role. Not to analyze them aggressively, but to listen with precision, to notice what is being said and what is being emphasized, to detect patterns in their language. What do they return to repeatedly? What concerns do they highlight? What outcomes seem to matter most to them? These signals, when observed over time, begin to reveal structure, not certainty, but direction. And direction is enough, because you do not need to know everything about someone to influence effectively. You need to understand enough to align your message with what matters to them. This is where influence becomes less about persuasion and more about connection, not emotional dependence, but intellectual and practical alignment. Because when someone hears their own priorities reflected in your communication, something shifts. They feel recognized, not flattered. Recognized. And recognition tends to increase openness. It reduces the need to defend. It reduces the need to resist, because the conversation no longer feels like a challenge. It feels like a collaboration. Now, this does not mean you simply agree with everything. It means you start from their position before guiding toward yours. This is a critical distinction, because many people try to move others without first understanding where they are. They present ideas as if context does not matter, as if logic alone should be enough. But context shapes interpretation, and without understanding context, your message often misses its target. So the first step is alignment, not agreement. Alignment, which means identifying common ground, even if it is small, even if it is subtle. Something both sides recognize as valid. This creates a foundation, a starting point, from which the conversation can move forward. Without that foundation, each new idea feels disconnected, and disconnected ideas are harder to accept. Now, let's go deeper. There is a pattern that appears frequently in human interaction. People tend to move toward what feels valuable and away from what feels threatening. This is not a fixed rule, but it is a consistent tendency. And understanding this helps you shape how your message is received. If your communication highlights loss, risk, or pressure too strongly, the other person may become cautious. Even if your intention is to help, if your communication highlights benefit, clarity, and stability, the other person is more likely to remain open. Again, not guaranteed, but more likely. So influence involves not only what you say, but how you frame it, not by distorting reality, but by choosing emphasis carefully, because the same idea can be presented in different ways. One creates tension, another creates consideration, and the difference often lies in framing. For example, presenting an idea as a correction may trigger resistance. Presenting the same idea as an addition, something that builds on what already exists, often feels more acceptable because it does not threaten the person's current position, it expands it. This is a subtle shift, but it changes the emotional tone of the conversation, and tone influences outcome. Now, there is another layer to understanding motivation. People are not only driven by outcomes, they are also driven by identity, how they see themselves, what they believe they represent. And when a message challenges that identity directly, resistance increases. Not because the idea is wrong, but because it feels like a personal threat. So, influence requires sensitivity to identity, not to manipulate it, but to respect it, to avoid unnecessary conflict, and to guide conversations in a way that allows the other person to adjust their thinking without feeling diminished. This is not about protecting ego, it is about maintaining constructive dialogue, because once someone feels diminished, their focus shifts from understanding to defense. And defense reduces influence. So the objective is to create space. Space where ideas can be explored without pressure, without immediate judgment, where the other person feels they can think rather than react. And creating that space requires patience. It requires resisting the urge to correct immediately, to prove a point quickly, to move faster than the conversation allows. Because influence is not about speed, it is about timing, and timing depends on readiness. If you move too quickly, you create resistance. If you move too slowly, you may lose engagement, so the skill lies in sensing pace, adjusting based on the other person's responses, not mechanically, but intuitively, based on observation. Now, this raises an important question. How do you observe without becoming passive? How do you listen deeply while still guiding the conversation? The answer lies in balance. You are not silent. You are selective. You contribute when it adds value, when it moves the conversation forward, not when it simply fills space. This creates a rhythm, a pattern of interaction that feels natural, not forced. And in that rhythm, influence grows, because the conversation feels structured, but not controlled, directed, but not dominated. Now, let's consider something more nuanced. People often communicate what they believe is acceptable to say. Not necessarily everything they think. This is not deception. It is filtering, and it happens automatically. So, what you hear is often a version of their thinking, not the complete picture. And this is why surface listening is not enough. You must listen for patterns, for consistency, for alignment between what they say and how they say it. Because inconsistencies often reveal areas of uncertainty, and uncertainty is where influence can be applied carefully, not by exploiting it, but by providing clarity, by offering perspectives that reduce confusion, that help organize their thinking. Because when people feel clearer, they become more confident in their decisions. And when your communication contributes to that clarity, your influence increases. Again, not because you push, but because you assist. Now, there is a final layer to this section, one that ties everything together: respect. Not as a concept, but as a behavior. Because understanding someone's motivation without respect leads to manipulation. Understanding it with respect leads to ethical influence. The difference is in intent. Are you trying to move them for your benefit alone? Or are you guiding the conversation toward a mutually beneficial outcome? People may not articulate this difference clearly, but they often sense it. And when they sense imbalance, they become cautious. So, maintaining respect is not only ethical, it is practical. It sustains influence over time. It builds credibility. And credibility compounds, each interaction reinforcing the next. Now, as you begin to integrate this level of understanding, something changes. You stop reacting to words alone, and you start responding to meaning, to patterns, to underlying direction. Your communication becomes more precise, more aligned, more effective. Not because you are controlling others, but because you are meeting them where they are and guiding from there. And that is the essence of this layer. To see clearly, to listen accurately, to respond with alignment, and to do so consistently. Because when you understand what truly matters to someone, your influence no longer feels like persuasion, it feels like relevance. And relevance is far more powerful than pressure. The precision of language, saying less, delivering more. Once you develop internal control and begin to understand human motivation with accuracy, a third layer of influence becomes available. And this layer is where most people believe influence begins. But in reality, it only becomes effective after the first two are stable. This layer is language. Not vocabulary, not complexity, but precision. Because influence is not about speaking more. It is about reducing friction in how your message is received. And friction is often created by excess. Too many words, too much explanation, too much urgency packed into a single moment. When this happens, clarity weakens. Not because the idea is unclear, but because it is overloaded. People do not resist ideas only because they disagree. They also resist when processing becomes difficult. When a message requires too much effort to follow, attention drops. When attention drops, influence fades. So the objective is not to impress with language, it is to deliver clarity with efficiency. To say enough, but not more than necessary. This requires discipline, because the natural tendency, especially when something matters, is to explain more, to add more reasons, to reinforce the point repeatedly. But this often has the opposite effect. It signals uncertainty, not confidence. Because when a message is strong, it tends to stand with fewer words. Not fewer ideas, but fewer unnecessary layers. Now, this does not mean being brief for the sake of brevity. It means being intentional with structure. Each sentence serving a purpose. Each phrase moving the conversation forward, not circling the same point repeatedly. This creates a different experience for the listener. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, they feel guided. Instead of trying to keep up, they can process comfortably. And when processing is comfortable, openness increases. This is where influence begins to feel smooth, not forced, not rushed, but clear. Now, let's examine something more subtle. The way you present an idea often matters as much as the idea itself, not in terms of style, but in terms of accessibility. If your message is framed in a way that aligns with how the other person already thinks, it becomes easier to accept. If it feels distant from their current perspective, it requires more effort, and more effort tends to reduce engagement. So precision in language includes adaptation, not changing your message, but adjusting how you express it so that it connects more directly. For example, if someone values efficiency, framing an idea in terms of time and effectiveness increases relevance. If someone values stability, framing the same idea in terms of reliability and consistency may resonate more. The core message remains unchanged, but the entry point shifts, and this shift often determines whether the idea is considered or dismissed. Now, this raises a concern for some people. Does adapting language mean compromising authenticity? The answer depends on intent. If the intent is to mislead, then yes, it becomes manipulation. But if the intent is to communicate clearly and respectfully, adaptation becomes a tool for understanding, not distortion, because different people process information differently, and effective communication accounts for that. Now, let's go deeper into structure. There is a pattern that tends to increase clarity in communication. Present context. Then introduce the idea. Then support it. Most people reverse this. They start with the idea. Then add context. Then repeat the idea again in different forms. And this creates confusion, because the listener does not yet have a framework to interpret the idea. So it feels abstract or disconnected. But when context comes first, the mind prepares. It begins to organize information. It anticipates structure. And when the idea arrives, it fits more easily. This is not a rule, but it is a tendency that improves clarity in many cases. Now, consider pacing. The speed at which you deliver your message matters, not only in terms of speaking rate, but in terms of conceptual density. If you introduce too many ideas too quickly, the listener may not fully process any of them. If you move too slowly, engagement may drop. So, pacing becomes a form of calibration, adjusting based on feedback. Subtle signals. Are they following? Are they engaged? Are they asking questions? Or are they becoming quiet in a way that suggests confusion? These signals guide your pace. Not rigid timing, but awareness. Now, there is another important element: silence. Most people underestimate its role. They feel the need to fill every gap, to maintain momentum. But silence, when used intentionally, increases impact. It gives space for processing. It allows ideas to settle. It signals confidence. Because you are not rushing to reinforce your point. You are allowing it to stand. This can feel uncomfortable at first, but over time it becomes a powerful tool because it shifts the rhythm of the conversation. It creates moments where the other person engages more actively, where they think, instead of just listening, and thinking leads to ownership, which strengthens influence. Now, let's address something critical: the difference between clarity and force. Many people believe that speaking firmly increases influence, and in some cases, firmness is necessary. But firmness without clarity creates pressure, and pressure often creates resistance. Clarity, on the other hand, reduces the need for force, because when an idea is understood, it does not need to be pushed as strongly. It carries itself. So the goal is not to increase intensity, it is to increase precision, to refine your language until it communicates exactly what is intended, without excess, without ambiguity. Now, there is also the matter of tone, not what you say, but how it sounds. Tone carries emotional information. It signals intention, and intention shapes interpretation. The same sentence can feel supportive or critical depending on tone, and tone is often detected faster than content. So managing tone becomes essential, not artificially, but consciously, ensuring that your delivery aligns with your intent. If your goal is to guide, your tone should reflect calm direction. If your goal is to explore, your tone should invite openness. Misalignment between tone and intent creates confusion, and confusion reduces influence. Now, let's move to a more advanced layer: Framing choices. Every message includes implicit choices. What you include, what you leave out, what you emphasize, what you present as primary, and what you present as secondary. These choices shape perception, not by altering facts, but by organizing them, and organization influences understanding. For example, presenting an idea as an opportunity tends to create openness. Presenting it as an obligation may create hesitation. Both may be true. But the frame determines the initial reaction. So the responsibility is to choose frames that are accurate and constructive, not misleading, but not unnecessarily restrictive either. Now, as you develop this level of precision, something changes in your communication. You begin to notice inefficiencies, redundancies, moments where fewer words would be stronger, moments where a pause would be more effective than another sentence. And gradually, your communication becomes sharper, not harsh, but refined. Each word carrying intention, each sentence contributing to clarity, and this refinement increases influence. Because people can follow you more easily. They can process your ideas without strain. They can engage without feeling overwhelmed. And when engagement increases, influence becomes more natural. Now, there is one final element, consistency. Because precision is not a one-time adjustment. It is a habit, a pattern that develops over time. And consistent precision builds a reputation. People begin to expect clarity from you. They listen more carefully, they engage more readily, because previous interactions have established trust in your communication. This is where influence compounds, not through isolated moments, but through repeated clarity, repeated alignment, repeated delivery of ideas in a way that feels structured and reliable. So, as you refine your language, remember this. You are not trying to say more. You are trying to remove what is unnecessary, to reveal what matters, to guide attention, without forcing it. Because when your words are precise, your message becomes easier to accept, not because it is imposed, but because it is understood. And understanding is where influence takes root. The architecture of subtle direction. At this stage, something begins to change in how you approach interaction. You are no longer focused only on what to say or how to say it. You begin to focus on how conversations move, because influence is not a single statement. It is a sequence, a progression, a carefully guided path where each step prepares the next. And most conversations fail, not because the ideas are weak, but because the sequence is broken. Ideas appear out of order, points are introduced too early, or conclusions are presented before the foundation has been established. And when this happens, resistance increases. Not because the other person is unwilling, but because the structure does not support understanding. So the discipline here is architectural. You begin to think in terms of flow. What needs to be understood first? What can follow naturally from that? What should be introduced later when readiness is higher? This is not manipulation. It is organization. It is presenting ideas in a way that aligns with how people process information. Because when information arrives in the right order, it feels clear. When it arrives out of order, it feels confusing, and confusion reduces influence. Now, consider how most people guide conversations. They react. They respond to whatever is said in the moment. They follow the surface of the dialogue without shaping its direction. And this creates randomness. The conversation moves, but without clear progression. And without progression, influence remains limited, because influence requires movement. Not forceful movement, but directional movement. A gradual shift from one point of understanding to another. So instead of reacting, you begin to guide, gently, without overt control. You introduce ideas that lead naturally to the next. You ask questions that open pathways. You allow the conversation to unfold. But within a structure, you are quietly maintaining. This requires awareness. You must track where the conversation is and where it needs to go, not rigidly, but intentionally. Now, one of the most effective ways to guide without force is through sequencing of agreement, starting with points that are easy to accept, not trivial, but accessible. Points that align with what the other person already recognizes as valid. This builds momentum, not dramatic momentum, but steady movement. And as agreement builds, openness tends to increase, not automatically, but often. Because agreement reduces tension. It creates a sense of alignment. And from that alignment, you can introduce more complex ideas that may not have been accepted earlier. But now, within the established context, feel more reasonable. This is not about leading someone step by step toward a predetermined conclusion. It is about creating a structure where understanding can develop naturally, where ideas connect logically, where each point supports the next. Now, let's explore something more subtle, the role of questions. Not as a tactic, but as a tool for clarity. Questions, when used carefully, do something powerful. They shift the focus from telling to thinking. Instead of delivering all the information, you invite the other person to engage with it, to process it actively. And active processing increases retention. It increases ownership. Because the idea is not only given, it is partially constructed in their own thinking. This does not mean asking excessive questions or using them in a way that feels interrogative. It means selecting questions that open space, that encourage reflection, that guide attention without forcing direction. For example, instead of stating a conclusion directly, you might ask a question that leads toward that conclusion, not to trap the person, but to involve them, to allow them to arrive at the idea with you. And when people arrive at an idea themselves, even partially, their resistance tends to decrease because it feels less imposed, more discovered. Now, there is a balance here. Too many questions can slow the conversation. Too few can make it one-sided. So again, awareness guides usage. You observe how the other person responds. If they engage, you continue. If they withdraw, you adjust. This responsiveness is part of guiding, because influence is not rigid. It adapts. Now, let's consider transitions. How you move from one idea to another. Abrupt transitions create friction. They make the conversation feel disjointed. But smooth transitions create continuity. They help the other person follow the progression. This can be as simple as referencing what was just discussed before introducing something new, connecting ideas explicitly, showing how one leads to the next. This reduces cognitive effort, and reduced effort increases engagement. Now, there is also the concept of timing, not just what to say, but when to say it. Some ideas, if introduced too early, create resistance. The same ideas introduced later, after context has been built, feel more acceptable. So, timing becomes a form of judgment. You assess readiness, not perfectly, but with increasing accuracy over time. And you adjust, delaying certain points, advancing others, based on the flow of the conversation. This requires patience, because the urge to deliver your strongest point early is common, but often it is more effective to build toward it, to prepare the ground first, so that when the idea arrives, it lands with clarity, not resistance. Now, there is a deeper layer, managing disagreement, because influence does not require the absence of disagreement. It requires the ability to navigate it. When disagreement appears, many people shift into defense. They try to protect their position, or they push harder to prove their point. But this often escalates tension, and tension reduces openness. So a different approach is needed. Acknowledgement, not agreement, but acknowledgement. Recognizing the other person's perspective as valid from their point of view. This does not weaken your position. It strengthens the conversation because it reduces opposition. It signals that the interaction is not a contest, but a process of understanding. And when opposition decreases, influence increases. Now, after acknowledgement, you can introduce your perspective, not as a correction, but as an addition. Something that expands the discussion, not something that invalidates what was said. This maintains respect, and respect sustains dialogue. Now, let's address something important. Guiding without force requires restraint. The ability to not say everything immediately, to hold certain points until the right moment, to allow the conversation to breathe. This can feel counterintuitive, especially when you believe you have a strong argument, but restraint increases effectiveness because it preserves timing, it prevents overload, and it maintains the structure of the conversation. Now, as you develop this skill, something becomes clear. Influence is not about dominating the conversation. It is about shaping its direction. Quietly, consistently, without creating resistance, without triggering unnecessary tension. And this shaping is subtle, often invisible, but its effects are significant because the conversation moves, ideas connect, understanding builds, and alignment becomes more likely. Not guaranteed, but more likely. Now, there is one final element, endings. How you conclude a conversation, or a segment of it. Most people end abruptly, or they repeat their main point. But effective endings reinforce clarity. They summarize direction. They leave the other person with a clear sense of what was discussed, not in a heavy way, but in a grounded way. A simple reflection, a concise statement, something that anchors the conversation. And this anchor increases retention. It helps the interaction continue beyond the moment. Now, as you integrate all of this, your conversations begin to change. They feel more structured, more intentional, less reactive, more fluid. You are not controlling people. You are guiding the process. And in that process, influence emerges, not as pressure, but as direction, not as force, but as clarity. And when conversations are guided with this level of awareness, something important happens. People do not feel pushed. They feel involved. And involvement is the foundation of lasting influence. Influencing without triggering resistance. At this level, influence becomes less about structure and more about sensitivity, not emotional sensitivity in a fragile sense, but perceptual sensitivity, the ability to detect emotional shifts as they happen and adjust accordingly. Because even the most precise language and the most structured conversation can lose effectiveness if emotional timing is ignored. People do not process ideas in a neutral state. They process them through how they feel in the moment. And that feeling is not static. It changes, sometimes gradually, sometimes instantly, and those changes influence how your message is received. So influence requires calibration, not only of your own internal state, but of the shared emotional environment. This is where many conversations become inefficient. The message may be logical, the structure may be sound, but the emotional state of the interaction is misaligned. And when that happens, resistance increases. Not always visibly, but internally. So the skill here is awareness, noticing subtle shifts, a slight tightening in tone, a pause that feels different from earlier pauses, a change in posture, pace, or engagement. These are signals, not conclusions, but indicators. They suggest that something has shifted. And when you detect that shift, your response determines what happens next. Do you continue as planned, or do you adjust? Most people continue. They follow their intended path, ignoring the shift, and this creates friction because the conversation moves forward, but the other person is no longer aligned. So calibration requires flexibility, the willingness to adjust in real time, to slow down when necessary, to clarify when confusion appears, to ease pressure when tension rises. This does not mean abandoning your objective. It means protecting the path toward it. Because if the path becomes blocked by emotional resistance, the objective becomes harder to reach. Now, let's explore something deeper. Emotional triggers, not in a dramatic sense, but in subtle forms. Moments where a word, a phrase, or a tone creates a defensive reaction. This can happen quickly, often without warning. And when it does, the conversation shifts. Not externally at first, but internally. The other person becomes less open, more guarded, and from that point, influence decreases. So the objective is not to avoid all triggers. That is not realistic, but to reduce unnecessary ones, to communicate in a way that minimizes defensiveness. This begins with language. Certain types of statements tend to increase resistance. Direct corrections, absolute statements, implied judgments. These forms of communication often feel confrontational, even if the intent is neutral, so replacing them with softer structures can improve response. Not weak structures, but balanced ones. For example, instead of stating something as a fixed conclusion, you might present it as a perspective. Something to consider, something that adds to the discussion. This reduces pressure. It keeps the conversation open. Now, tone plays a critical role here, because tone can either soften or intensify a message. A neutral sentence delivered with tension can feel critical. A complex idea delivered calmly can feel accessible. So, emotional calibration includes tone management, not artificially, but consciously, ensuring that your tone supports your intent. If your goal is to guide, your tone should not create unnecessary friction. Now, there is another important factor. Emotional pacing. Just as ideas require pacing, emotions do as well. If a conversation becomes too intense too quickly, people may withdraw. If it remains too flat, engagement may decrease. So you adjust, not dramatically, but subtly, maintaining a level of engagement that supports thinking, not overwhelms it. Now let's consider the role of validation, not agreement, but validation. Acknowledging that the other person's perspective makes sense within their context. This does not mean you adopt their view, it means you recognize it. And recognition reduces defensiveness, because people do not feel ignored or dismissed. They feel heard. And when people feel heard, they become more open to hearing. This is reciprocal, not guaranteed, but often present. So validation becomes a bridge between differing perspectives. Now, after validation, you can introduce your own perspective, not as a contradiction, but as an addition, something that expands the discussion. This maintains balance, and balance sustains engagement. Now, there is also the concept of emotional steadiness, your ability to remain consistent even when the other person's emotions fluctuate. This is not about controlling them. It is about not mirroring instability, because when both sides become reactive, the conversation loses structure. But when one side remains steady, it creates an anchor, a point of stability, and that stability can influence the overall tone, not immediately, but gradually. So maintaining your own emotional control continues to be essential, even at this stage. Now, let's go deeper into subtle resistance. Not all resistance is visible. Sometimes it appears as silence, short responses, reduced engagement. These are not always signs of disagreement, but they often indicate reduced openness. So when you notice this, the response is not to push harder. It is to reassess, to ask a clarifying question, to adjust your approach, to re-engage the conversation, because pushing against silent resistance tends to increase it. Now, there is a balance here. You do not want to overanalyze every signal, but you do want to remain aware, responsive, adaptive. Now, consider emotional contrast. Moments where you shift tone slightly to create emphasis, not dramatically, but enough to highlight importance. This can increase attention, it can signal that something matters, but it must be used carefully. Too much contrast creates instability. Too little creates monotony. So again, calibration. Now, there is one more layer, respecting emotional boundaries. Not every conversation is ready for every level of depth. Not every person is open to every type of discussion. So influence includes knowing when not to push, when to pause, when to allow time. Because forcing depth where it is not welcome creates resistance. But respecting boundaries builds trust, and trust allows deeper conversations later. Now, as you integrate emotional calibration, something shifts. Your communication becomes more responsive, less rigid, more aligned with the moment. You begin to sense when to move forward and when to adjust, when to clarify, and when to pause. And this sensitivity increases influence because the conversation feels natural, not forced, balanced, not pressured. Now, there is a final element, emotional consistency over time. Not perfection, but reliability, because people begin to recognize patterns. If your communication remains steady across interactions, trust increases. If it fluctuates unpredictably, trust decreases. So consistency becomes part of your influence, not in what you say alone, but in how you engage. Now, as this section concludes, remember this. Influence is not only about guiding thought, it is about respecting emotion. Because thought and emotion are not separate in communication. They are connected. And when both are aligned, influence becomes more effective. Not through pressure, but through understanding. Not through force, but through calibration. And when you master this layer, your communication begins to feel different. Not heavier, but smoother. Not more intense, but more precise. And in that precision, influence grows. Quietly, consistently, effectively. Consistency, credibility, and long-term influence. At this final stage of the framework, influence is no longer about individual conversations. It becomes about patterns, repetition, accumulation. Because the most reliable form of influence is not created in a single interaction. It is built over time through consistent behavior, consistent communication, consistent alignment between what you say and what you do. And this is where many people underestimate the process. They focus on moments, on key conversations, on opportunities to persuade. But long-term influence is not event-based. It is pattern-based. People observe. They remember. They compare your behavior across situations. And from that, they form conclusions. Not always consciously, but consistently. Is this person reliable? Do they remain steady under pressure? Do their words align with their actions? Do they communicate with clarity? Even when things are uncertain, these questions shape credibility. And credibility determines how much influence you carry before you even speak. Because when credibility is strong, your ideas receive attention faster. They are considered more seriously. They are given space. Not because they are perfect, but because the source is trusted. Now, this does not mean people agree with you automatically, but it increases the likelihood that they will listen carefully, and careful listening is where influence begins. So, the focus shifts from convincing in the moment to building a reputation that supports your influence over time. This requires consistency, not perfection, but reliability. Your tone does not fluctuate unpredictably. Your communication remains measured. Your responses remain intentional, even when the context changes. Because inconsistency creates uncertainty. And uncertainty reduces trust. Now, let's go deeper. There is a subtle distinction between short-term agreement and long-term influence. Short-term agreement can be achieved through pressure, through urgency, through strong assertion. But long-term influence requires something else: respect, trust, clarity. And these cannot be forced. They develop through repeated interactions where the other person experiences your communication as fair, as balanced, as grounded. So each interaction becomes part of a larger pattern, a data point in how you are perceived. And over time, these data points form a clear image, not only of what you say, but of how you operate. Now, consider accountability, one of the strongest drivers of credibility. When you acknowledge uncertainty where it exists, when you adjust your position based on new information, when you correct yourself without defensiveness, your credibility increases, not decreases, because it signals honesty. And honesty builds trust. In contrast, rigid certainty can create distance, even if it appears confident, because people sense when flexibility is absent. An absence of flexibility can feel limiting. So, balanced confidence becomes key. You present your ideas clearly, but you remain open to refinement. This does not weaken your influence. It strengthens it, because it shows that your goal is clarity, not dominance. Now let's explore something important: alignment between words and actions. If your communication suggests one set of values, but your behavior reflects another, credibility weakens. Not immediately, but over time, because people notice patterns. They may not confront them directly, but they adjust their trust accordingly. So influence requires integrity, not as a concept, but as a consistent alignment between what you express and how you act. This alignment reduces friction. It makes your communication more believable because it is supported by evidence. Now, there is also the role of restraint. Not every situation requires you to assert influence. Not every conversation requires direction. Sometimes the most effective choice is to observe, to listen, to allow the situation to develop. This restraint is often misunderstood as passivity, but it is strategic. Because it preserves credibility, it avoids unnecessary pressure, and it maintains balance. Now, when you do choose to speak, your words carry more weight because they are not constant. They are selective, and selectivity increases impact. Now, let's consider long-term relationships. Influence deepens over time when interactions are consistent, predictable in tone, but not rigid in thought, flexible in approach, but stable in values. This creates trust, and trust reduces resistance, because the other person becomes familiar with your communication style. They understand your intent, they know what to expect, and familiarity increases comfort. Now, comfort does not mean agreement, but it means the conversation can continue, even during disagreement. And continued dialogue is essential for influence, because influence rarely happens instantly. It develops across multiple interactions. Now, there is another layer. Reputation beyond direct interaction. What others say about you when you are not present. This is influenced by how you communicate consistently. If your interactions are respectful, clear, and balanced, others are more likely to describe you in those terms. And this extends your influence, because people form expectations before they meet you, and those expectations shape how they receive your communication. So, influence is not limited to direct contact. It expands through perception, through shared experiences, through consistent behavior across contexts. Now, let's go deeper into patience. Long-term influence requires it, because not every conversation will lead to immediate alignment. Some will end without clear agreement. Some will require time, reflection, distance. And in those cases, pushing further may reduce influence, while allowing space may preserve it. So patience becomes a form of discipline, the ability to step back without losing direction, to maintain clarity without forcing resolution. This balance is essential. Now, consider feedback. Not only what you give, but what you receive. When you invite feedback, when you listen without immediate defense, when you adjust, based on useful input, you strengthen your credibility, because it shows that your communication is not one-directional. It is responsive, and responsiveness builds trust. Now, there is a final element: identity. Not the identity of others, but your own. How you see yourself in the context of communication. If you view influence as control, your behavior may become forceful. If you view it as guidance, your behavior becomes measured. So, your internal definition shapes your external actions, and refining that definition is part of mastering influence. You are not trying to dominate conversations. You are trying to improve them, to make them clearer, more structured, more productive. And when that becomes your standard, your behavior aligns naturally. Now, as all these elements come together, something shifts. Influence becomes less effortful. Not because it requires no effort, but because it becomes integrated. Part of how you think, part of how you communicate, part of how you engage with others. And over time, this integration creates consistency. Consistency builds credibility. Credibility strengthens influence. And influence, when grounded in these principles, becomes sustainable, not temporary. Not dependent on specific situations, but present across contexts. Now, as this section concludes, remember this. The highest level of influence is not measured by how many people agree with you in a moment. It is measured by how consistently your communication creates clarity, trust, and thoughtful engagement over time. Because those qualities endure. They extend beyond individual conversations. They shape relationships, they shape perception, and they shape outcomes in ways that are not always immediate, but are often lasting. And that is the real objective, not control, not persuasion alone, but the ability to guide thinking responsibly, consistently, and effectively. The quiet authority of ethical influence. There is a point, after enough reflection and practice, where influence begins to feel different. not stronger in the way most people expect, but quieter, more controlled, less urgent, and far more effective. Because by now, the idea of influencing people should no longer feel like an external skill you apply only when needed. It becomes part of how you think, how you observe, how you communicate, and most importantly, how you regulate yourself within interaction. You begin to notice something subtle. The less you try to force outcomes, the more conversations begin to move naturally. Not in every case, not with every person, but often enough that the pattern becomes clear. Force creates resistance. Clarity creates movement. Pressure creates hesitation. Stability creates openness. And over time, you stop chasing agreement. You begin to focus on something more fundamental, creating the conditions where agreement becomes possible. This is a shift in identity. From someone who tries to persuade to someone who communicates with structure, awareness, and intent. Because influence, at its highest level, is not about convincing people to follow your thinking. It is about helping them think more clearly in your presence. And when that happens, your ideas are no longer competing for attention. They become part of the thinking process itself. This is where influence becomes sustainable, not dependent on energy, not dependent on timing alone, but grounded in consistency, in the way you show up repeatedly. Now, as you reflect on everything covered, there is a pattern that connects it all. Internal control, understanding, precision, structure, calibration, consistency. These are not separate techniques. They are layers of the same system, each one supporting the next, each one reinforcing the whole. And when they operate together, your communication becomes different. Not louder, not more complex, but more effective. Because it is aligned with how people process information, aligned with how they respond to emotional tone, aligned with how trust is built over time. Now, there is something important to recognize. You will not apply all of this perfectly, not immediately, not consistently at first, and that is expected, because influence is not mastered through theory. It is refined through experience, through real conversations, real moments where things do not go as planned, where resistance appears, where your initial approach does not work. And in those moments, you adjust, you observe, you learn, not with frustration, but with awareness. Because every interaction becomes feedback, not just about others, but about yourself, how you respond, how you adapt, how you maintain control under pressure. And gradually, this feedback shapes your behavior. It refines your timing, your language, your presence, until what once required effort becomes more natural. Now, there is a tendency, especially when learning influence, to look for results, to measure success by agreement, by outcomes, by visible changes in others. But the deeper measure is different. It is the quality of the interaction. Did the conversation remain clear? Did it remain respectful? Did it allow both sides to think? Did it move forward, even slightly? Because influence is not always immediate. But progress is often visible in small shifts, in reduced resistance, in increased openness, in more thoughtful responses. These are indicators, not guarantees, but signs that your approach is effective. And over time, these small shifts accumulate. They create momentum. They shape relationships. They build credibility. And eventually they lead to outcomes that feel stable, not forced, but earned. Now, let's return to something fundamental: ethics. Because influence without ethics becomes unstable. It may work temporarily, but it does not sustain. People sense imbalance, they adjust, they withdraw. So maintaining ethical alignment is not only a principle, it is a requirement for long-term effectiveness. It ensures that your influence remains grounded, that it benefits both sides, that it builds rather than erodes trust, and this alignment protects your credibility, because credibility, once weakened, is difficult to rebuild. So, every interaction becomes a choice, not a dramatic one, but a consistent one. Do you communicate with clarity or with pressure? Do you guide or do you push? Do you listen to understand or to respond? These choices seem small in isolation, but repeated over time, they define your influence. Now, there is also the role of restraint, knowing when not to speak, when to allow silence, when to let the other person process. This restraint is often where influence deepens, because it shows confidence, not in your ability to argue, but in your ability to hold space. And holding space allows others to engage more fully, to think more clearly, to arrive at ideas with less resistance. Now, consider how this changes your interactions over time. You become less reactive, more deliberate, less focused on winning moments, more focused on guiding direction, less concerned with immediate agreement, more attentive to long-term alignment. And this shift creates a different kind of presence, one that is not forceful, but steady, not dominant, but reliable. And reliability builds trust. Now, as you continue to apply these principles, something becomes evident. Influence is not a fixed skill. It evolves. It adapts. It becomes more refined with each interaction, because people are different. Contexts change, situations vary, and your ability to adjust within those variations determines your effectiveness. So, flexibility becomes part of your discipline. Not inconsistency, but adaptability within a stable framework. Now, there is one final perspective to consider. Influence is not something you own, it is something others grant you, based on how you show up, based on how you communicate, based on how consistently you demonstrate clarity, respect, and control. And because it is granted, it must be maintained, not through effort alone, but through alignment, through continued attention to how you engage. Now, as this concludes, the goal is not to remember every detail. It is to internalize the direction, to begin noticing more, responding more deliberately, communicating with greater precision. And over time, these adjustments will compound. They will shape your interactions. They will strengthen your credibility, and they will increase your influence. Not dramatically at first, but steadily, consistently, in a way that feels natural, not forced. And that is the real mastery, not the ability to control outcomes, but the ability to guide conversations with clarity, awareness, and integrity. Because when those elements are present, influence does not need to be asserted. It is recognized, and when it is recognized, it becomes effective. Quietly, reliably, over time. The end